Hello, everybody. Danky here, back with another exciting, punishing episode of Prager Eww. Today we are going to be looking at a video called Why You Should Be a Nationalist. So, hopefully we're going to find out why you should be a nationalist.
Britain votes to leave the European Union. The United States elects a president who says he'll put America first. Around the world,
America First, by the way, was there was essentially an American Nazi party during the early days of Adolf Hitler's reign in Germany, and their slogan was America First. So it's good to see Donald Trump keeping the tradition alive. Uh,
nationalism is winning elections. Many see this nationalist revival as the great danger of our time,
it
fearing
really
that nationalism will take us back to a more primitive and racist past.
It really will.
But it wasn't long ago that great political figures such as Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, David Ben-Gurion and
All right, Woodrow Wilson famously was like one of the most racist anti-immigrant, and Teddy Roosevelt was an imperialist scumbag.
Mahatma Gandhi, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher.
Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher? What?
Recognized what I call the virtue of nationalism.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
So what is this virtue?
I'm sure they did recognize
A nationalist believes that the world is governed best when nations are free to chart their own independent course, cultivating their traditions and pursuing their interests without interference.
Pursuing their interest without interference. But of course, what happens when your interests intervenes with another nation's interest? Like, let's say nation A wants to pollute the shit out of the atmosphere. Nation B doesn't want to do that. You have a conflict there that arises from nationalism, leading pretty much directly to imperialism.
Nationalism is not about racism. All nations are internally diverse.
All nations are internally diverse. But nationalism is about trying to mold a common identity from that diversity, if that makes sense.
It isn't about isolationism. Of course, nations can pursue a variety of different policies in diplomacy and trade. Nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, or globalism, or transnationalism, which are all names for the attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority.
All right. Imperialism is when a capitalist country invades another country with the purposes of building capitalist markets in that country, for the sake of stealing their resources. So by that end, I mean, how is nationalism not imperialistic? Nationalism says we are going to take whatever we need for our nation. All other people be damned. Our folk must survive.
The debate between nationalists and globalists, then, is over whether we should aspire to a world of many independent nations, or to be one unified superstate, like the Enlightened Federation of the Star Trek movies.
Okay, they're saying like that's a bad thing. If we could be like the United Federation in the Star Trek movies, I think that would be great. I don't know what this guy's problem is. Maybe he's not a Star Trek fan, but
a case can be made for both sides of the argument. But for the last 30 years, really since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union, the one world side has been dominant. Today, this is changing. Maybe not among elites, but among ordinary citizens, or as they're known in America, the deplorables. It turns out that a lot of people still think good borders make good neighbors.
That guy in the red MAGA hat, he didn't really want to stand next to that black dude, but they made him do it for the Prager University video. But he didn't really want to. You can tell. I mean, look at his face. His nose is kind of like crinkled up, like he's disgusted. He's like, ugh.
It's hardly surprising that people want to preserve the way of life they and their ancestors built up over centuries, the way of life they believe is best.
They the way of life they built up over centuries of what exploitation, slavery. I mean, look at American history. American history is a history of slavery and capitalist exploitation and imperialism.
It's human nature. Our strongest loyalties are to those who are closest to us, to our family, then the larger community or tribe, and finally to the nation.
This guy's literally
Long
calling
ago,
for
it was discovered
tribalism.
that the key to human freedom is to build political life out of this natural loyalty.
He is
By putting
literally
decision-making
making
in
a
the hands
political
of the
call for
family, the
tribalism.
community, and the independent nation, you could get people to cooperate with one another, join in the common defense, and willingly obey laws.
Willingly
The only
obey the law.
alternative to
Listen
this
to
kind
the
of community
Führer.
and
Listen
nation-based
to the
politics
supreme leader.
is to use force, to coerce obedience. In the 20th century, communism and Nazism both sought to impose a universal vision at gunpoint. Both the communists
What was the difference between the communists and the Nazis, though? It's almost like they had entirely different ideologies. Just because they both pointed guns at people doesn't mean their reasons for pointing the guns at people were different.
and the Nazis were imperialists.
That's bullshit. Communists and Nazis weren't imperialists. Imperialists, by definition, is moribund capitalism. I'll make a video on that in the future.
They wanted to eliminate the independent nations of the world. Nationalism holds that borders are
The communist struggle wasn't to eliminate the nations of the world, it was to unify the nations of the world under a proletarian revolution. It's nationalism that seeks to carve the world up into a bajillion little nations.
crucial. The border is where each nation's ambitions should stop. This idea first appears in the Bible, where Moses gives borders to Israel
And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why Jesus was a Nazi.
and tells the Jews they'll be punished if they trouble their neighbors. True to its biblical roots, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century made the independent nation.
Another little fact about Martin Luther, since they decided to include him in this video. Martin Luther hated Jewish people with a fervent passion. He also hated women. He would also eat his own excrement as a means of self-flagellation. So he was a really, he's not the kind of guy you want to be quoting.
State, the political cornerstone of the modern world. When Henry VIII declared that England would no longer obey dictates from Rome, he became Europe's first true nationalist. Soon, additional
Europe's
nations
first
declared
true
their
nationalist.
independence. The Dutch from Spain and America from Britain, to cite just two examples. The competition among these newly independent peoples led to an explosion of innovation, bringing unprecedented progress in science, industry, and government. For nearly 400 years, the principle.
So this argument is we should all be nationalistic because the quote-unquote competition that arises between the nations competing for resources, land, labor, will spur us forward instead of result in wars. Oh, I don't know, like World War fucking One, which was extremely destructive, killed untold amounts of lives, and to this day, not a single person can argue that it was even remotely beneficial. So, great job, big-brained you, for arguing the logic that led to World War One.
Of national independence served as the foundation for a better, freer world. But World War I and World War II changed everything.
Oh,
Traumatized
yeah, they did.
by these catastrophic conflicts, many now seek comfort in a simplistic narrative, ceaselessly repeated, that nationalism caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust.
They did.
But this is one of the great untruths of our time.
All right, well then
Adolf
what
Hitler
did?
was no nationalist. He was an imperialist.
Adolf Hitler was no nationalist. He was an imperial. They say they say that like nationalism and imperialism are both uh not the same thing. You can be nationalistic and imperialistic at the same time. Look at how Italy, fascist Italy colonized Ethiopia. Just for an example.
If his ambitions had been limited to ruling Germans, it would have been terrible for Germany. But the French, the British, the Russians, and everyone else would have been spared a world war. Sadly, European elites learned the wrong lesson, believing that independent nations are inherently dangerous. Better, they
Yeah.
reasoned, that all countries should live under one government. In 1992, this vision gave birth to the European Union. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher hated the
Boo.
idea. She didn't want the bureaucrats
All
in
right.
Brussels
This is I'm I don't have enough information, enough education about the politics of the European Union to really give an opinion, but I do know one thing. Margaret Thatcher is a salty bitch and she is a horrible human being, and I'm glad that she is dead.
making decisions for Brits in Birmingham. But in the utopian 1990s, Britain thought it was better to dump Thatcher and go with Brussels.
Dump
It's the
Thatcher. They should
spirit
have
of
done that
Margaret
long
Thatcher,
ago.
and indeed of Henry VIII, that reasserted itself in Britain's vote for independence.
And wasn't Henry VIII the guy that chopped off all of his wives' heads? Like, what the fuck? Why would you? You're following in the legacy of Henry VIII. It's like I would not want to be following in that legacy. Sorry.
From Europe in June 2016. Donald Trump tapped into the same spirit of nationalism 5 months later in November 2016.
So, I mean, they tried so hard to say that Hitler wasn't a nationalist, but he obviously was. Uh, and I mean, they're openly admitting that Donald Trump's a nationalist. So, I mean, from this, what am I to take? But that they're basically saying like Donald Trump is a nationalist. You should be a nationalist, even though Hitler wasn't. But Donald Trump totally is.
Nationalism is making a comeback. If you care about freedom, you should hope it succeeds.
All right, if you care about
I'm Yoram
freedom,
Khazoni,
you
author
need
of The
to
Virtue of
squelch
Nationalism for Prager
this
University.
fascist nationalistic
Thank you for
tendencies.
watching this video. To
Not
help
help
keep
it.
Prager Eww videos free, please
Oh, shut up. That was disgusting. Thank you for watching, but yeah, that was a really disgusting video. Thank you.